Good morning, brothers and sisters. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples. But the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. Just as a little bit of background information about these two verses, these chapters, but specifically about these verses, Isaiah describes the glorious task that God had given the Israelites, his chosen people. But as we all know, they failed in their mandate, and then God was no longer able to save them from their enemies, nor use them as his instruments to bring salvation to the Gentiles. Henceforth, the privileges and the responsibilities were transferred to spiritual Israel, which we believe in this day and age are the children of God, sons and daughters of God, and it is our duty to be a light in the darkness. And if we think about darkness, I'm sure we can all relate. You were all talking about helping out in the floods that took place in Ottawa. Who would have thought? Ottawa, flooded city, darkness. Losing a job, darkness. Financial hardship, darkness. Health issues, darkness. So I know that's something that we can all relate to. So what is this idea of bringing light to the darkness, to rising and shining in the darkness? We'll explore that today through a story in the Old Testament. Midday sun beats down on a dry, dusty path. Hot and tired, the travelers are relieved to see a patch of greenery ahead. They look forward to the rest that will come at the end of their journey, when they can enjoy the shade of the great spreading tree and the cool water nearby. More than anything, though, they look forward to the spiritual refreshing that awaits them. God-fearing men, in an ancient land where few people could read and write, the travelers looked to the Lord's messengers to tell them the stories of their people's past and give them hope for the future. Wise leaders of the past, men like Moses, Caleb, Joshua, had not only interpreted God's law, but also provided guidance for daily living. Now, a new messenger had set up camp under this famous tree near the well-traveled roadside. This messenger claimed to have words from God to share with a people in desperate need of guidance. But there was something unexpected. Even though the travelers knew that they would find this before they arrived, they were still a little surprised at what they saw. For there, beneath the palm tree, sharing words of wisdom with those who came looking for it and for help, was a woman. And the woman was Deborah. And let's turn together to Judges 4, the book of Judges 4, verse 4 and 5. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. So why was Deborah's role so unusual? Though the Bible mentions one woman who was a prophet before Deborah's time, and let's see who knows their Bible stories. Who was it? There was only one woman before Deborah. Miriam, yes. Only one prophet woman who was before Deborah's time. Deborah is the first and only woman described as a leader and a judge of ancient Israel. She is the first woman we see in leadership role in the Bible. God called Deborah to her task in a society where women were expected to tend the home and care for the children. And don't worry, my sermon is not a feminist sermon. I'm not going in that direction, but we're just describing the culture of that time. That in that moment, women were expected to tend to the home and care for the children. Few women ventured outside of that role. It was a scary role because it was unfamiliar. Most men had little respect for women's wisdom, and for men to look up to a woman as their leader and a judge was almost unthinkable. And so we go back to Isaiah 60, verse 1 and 2. Arise, shine, for your light has come. And that's what Deborah was doing. I wonder what Deborah thought when God called her to become his messenger and a leader in Israel. The Bible doesn't really tell us how her ministry began or how her journey, what her calling was. We don't know how God called her. We can only assume, unusual as the call was, that she responded willingly. Now, if you go back to Judges 4, verse 4, it says that Deborah was leading Israel at that time. And what was that time? Let's backtrack a little bit. Let's go to Judges 4, verse 1 and 2, which says, Again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. Darkness. Something that we can all relate to. So let's ask ourselves a few questions. Why were these people in darkness again? Why were they oppressed? Again, it's not like they hadn't experienced this over and over again. How can they make the same mistake over and over again? How can they be so blind? Won't they ever learn? And that's a question we can ask ourselves. Why don't we learn? Sometimes we bring the darkness upon ourselves. Not always. But sometimes that's what we do. Why don't we ever learn? In Patriarchs and Prophets, on page 544, Ellen White writes the following. Until the generation that had received instruction from Joshua became extinct, idolatry made little headway. But the parents had prepared the way for the apostasy of their children. The disregard of the Lord's restrictions on the part of those who came in possession of Canaan sowed seed of evil that continued to bring forth bitter fruit for generations. The simple habits of the Hebrews had secured them physical health, but association with the heathen led to the indulgence of appetite and passion, which gradually lessened physical strength and enfeebled the mental and moral powers. By their sins, the Israelites were separated from God. His strength was removed from them, and they could no longer prevail against their enemies. Thus, they were brought into subjection to the very nations that through God they might have subdued. So they're back to square one. Same as if they had stayed in Egypt, same darkness. As Deborah first moved into the challenging, unfamiliar role, she probably didn't guess that God had an even bigger task for her. At God's inspiration, Deborah called on a powerful Israelite chieftain, a soldier named Barak. No, not Obama. It was Barak from the Old Testament, a man of God, a soldier who was ready to stand up to darkness, to arise and to shine. He would help men in Israel regain their freedom. And we could stop here, we could pause and again get sidetracked by what the sermon is not about, or by what some people might think, oh, this is the lesson to be learned here. Barak had to obey Deborah, and so again, women's lib, feminism, that's not what it's about. It's about working together, teamwork. What does it read? Together, everyone achieves more. And that's what we need to remind ourselves when we arise and shine, that working together, not against each other, is what will help shine the light and accomplish the mission and the purpose that God has for his people, for the spiritual Israel that is supposed to arise and shine together. It's about collaborating together, to work in unity, to give glory to God. It's not a power struggle. It's not men versus women, children versus adults. We know that the Bible is full of examples of people who were underrated, underaged, unqualified, that God used because they were willing to arise and to shine a light. Another important point to highlight about Barak. He was ready. He had been preparing for a long time. He was available. Deborah knew of him. She didn't call, people to say, let's see who wants to go and fight. No, she went directly to him. She knew that he was trained. He was available. And that's something that we have to learn. We don't have to wait until God calls us to become prepared and to shine our light. We have to be ready. We have to be available. But Barak was afraid. He hesitated. Perhaps he was unsure. That would be the natural tendency, the natural human tendency. He wanted to be assured of the victory. So he said to Deborah, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." Does that mean that Barak didn't trust God? Does that mean that he was unprepared? Or does that mean that he was simply working as a team, knowing that if Deborah made the call, and she was the leader of God at the time, then he would work in collaboration with her? And that's a lesson that we have to learn in spite of our fears, in spite of us wanting victories assured. We need to work together and drive back the forces of oppression, of spiritual oppression. And so Deborah did go into battle with Barak, and their armies won a huge victory. What Israelite wife and mother of those days would ever have imagined herself marching and heading a rebel army? In fact, that today, even in modern society, would be quite unheard of. Leading men into battle. It was an unthinkable role for a woman. Yet, as Deborah responded to God's call, he led her to unexpected places. He took the gifts and talents that he had given her and challenged her to use them in ways that she had never imagined. Responding to that call must have taken a lot of courage and a lot of trust in God, and Deborah did it. Can you relate to Deborah? Do you feel God is calling you to serve him in ways that might be, frankly, a little frightening? There's an old saying that says, God does not call the qualified. He qualifies the called. We often feel unqualified for the tasks that God invites us to do. Those tasks might involve taking an unpopular public stand on perhaps a controversial issue, or taking a frontline role in meeting a need in your community. God's call might require you to shed your shyness and speak in front of your women's group or your congregation or your school, neighborhood, or workplace. God may be calling you to be faithful in a difficult family situation, perhaps, or to stand up for what you know is right, even though friends and co-workers don't honor your convictions. Perhaps God is calling you, like Deborah, to take on a task for him that others may question or disapprove of. And we go back to arising and shining, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. That's what God calls us to do. God's heroines and heroes of faith knew what it meant to be unqualified for God's call. If you think back to some of his greatest prophets, Moses, Jeremiah, they questioned God when he called them, wondering if they actually had the qualifications to go ahead with the call of God, to do what was required. Was Deborah afraid? Did she doubt whether she was qualified enough to be a prophetess and a judge? The Bible doesn't really say, it doesn't really record any of her thoughts. Yet any woman, even the most confident, would have been surprised to be pulled from her accepted role and thrust into a position of such authority. And there we see Deborah together with Barak and joining them in the army. You know, it's very easy to give out orders, right? To be bossy and to tell other people what to do, right? At least for me, it comes naturally. So it's really easy to be that person who tells everybody else what to do. But here's a lesson for me, at least, in what Deborah did. She told Barak, go fight, lead the men. He said, no, I want you to come with me. And she wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. She wasn't afraid to go in where she was needed. She didn't just sit up in her high horse, or under the palm tree in that case, and waited for other people to do the work for her. She actually joined Barak in the front lines, giving him the assurance that he needed. But sometimes our role is that of giving assurance, and not only being in the front lines. There is a role for everybody to play. Let's go to verse 14 and 15 of the same chapter, Judges 4, verse 14 and 15. Then Deborah said to Barak, go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? So Barak went down to Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. An action-packed chapter. So, yes, they're winning the war. The 900 chariots, the steel and the iron chariots that verse 1 and 2 had talked about, are no more. They are of no use in that battle. Sisera, Captain Sisera, runs away. He gets off his chariot and he runs away, and the enemy escapes. He gets away. And you would think, well, that's it? That's what was the point of rising up and shining in that darkness? Well, we come to another unexpected turn of events. For those of you who know the story, this is probably one of the most gory stories in the Old Testament. So I'm not going to go into details. But yet another part of the victory is won through a seemingly random person, a random woman in the Old Testament, who perhaps was not even an Israelite, she sees, I'm just going to briefly talk about it, she sees Sisera running away. She's in her tent. She gets out. She says, come to my tent. You're safe here. You can sleep, you can rest because you've been at war. She feeds him, etc., etc. And then she kills him in his sleep. So that's, Deborah had said in her prophecy to Barak that the victory would be given through the hand of a woman. The Lord would deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. And again, not because it's a man or a woman, but because God uses unexpected people. And God takes us to unexpected places. Though God called Deborah to fill what was then considered a man's role, he drew upon her female talents and strengths in that case. In the biblical poem that describes Deborah's accomplishments, a poem this multi-talented woman herself might have composed, Deborah describes herself as a mother in Israel. Her ability to nurture, to care for others, and to make wise decisions was cultivated in her home as she reared her own children, possibly. When God called her to be a mother to an entire nation, she was able to take those same strengths and gifts and use them in a far larger field. The same as Barak. He trained with his natural talents and abilities, waiting for the call of God. But if we're never prepared, if we're never active in the role and in the place that God calls us to be, he's not going to call us to a higher bidding because we're not being faithful in what we have at hand. Why would he call us to a far larger field? So we go back to the end of the war. Deborah composed a national anthem, and you can actually read it. Bible scholars say that's actually one of the most beautiful songs or anthems. It's very similar to a national anthem. If you think of the national anthem of your own country, it's usually related to victories and wars or some sort of gain. And so this woman of Israel, Deborah, composed a national anthem. You can read it. We're not going to read the whole thing today. The whole of chapter 5 is the Song of Deborah. And she celebrates the victory. And it ends in verse 31. The last verse in chapter 5 says, she writes, or she sings, "So may all your enemies perish, O Lord. But may they who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength." And what is the sun? What do we associate the sun with? Today the sun is out. There's so much more light, right? And so, again, we go back to our verse in Isaiah 60, verse 1 and 2. "Arise and shine, for your light has come." And when there's light in darkness, it's the glory of the Lord that is present. And we know that because the Bible records and documents in verse 31 that the land had peace, not for 1 or 2 years, but for 40 years. And that's what the light of God does in our lives. It brings peace, long-lasting peace. So God has a call for each one of us today. He has a call for you. He has a call for me. It may be in a leadership position in the public eye, like Deborah's. Or it may be in a quiet, behind-the-scenes kind of role that makes great work possible. Whatever your task, you will probably have moments when you wonder, can I do it? Am I talented enough? Strong enough? Brave enough? Smart enough? What if people don't understand? What if people don't approve? When God's call seems to be too much of a challenge, think of Deborah. Imagine a wife and a mother who finds herself marching to battle at the head of God's army. God's call can indeed lead us to very unexpected places. But we never go there alone. He calls us, He qualifies us, and He is with us every step of the way. And if you think God can't use you, then think again. Because Jacob was a cheater. Peter had a temper. David had an affair. Noah got drunk. Jonah ran away from God. Paul was a murderer. Gideon was insecure. Miriam was a gossiper. Martha was a worrier. Thomas was a doubter. Sarah was impatient. Elijah was depressed. Moses stuttered. Zacchaeus was short. And Abraham was old. And Lazarus was dead. So you are good enough. Don't forget that God qualifies you. If He calls you, if He leads you to unexpected places, God will qualify you. One thing is for certain and for sure, that we are called to arise and to shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples. But the Lord rises upon you, and His glory appears over you. May God lead you and direct you in your rising up and shining. And may you bring glory in the glory of God in places of darkness. Amen.